Adding and subtracting rational expressions with the different denominators. So we've talked about how to find the least common denominator, and remember, when you add or subtract rational expressions, you have to have a common denominator. To multiply and divide, you do not have to have a common denominator, but to add and subtract, you do have to have a common denominator. So step number 1 is find the least common denominator, and remember to do that, you're going to factor your denominators, and you're going to write down anything that you see that's already in common, and then write down anything that's not in common, and that's your common denominator. Then you're going to rewrite the rational expressions, and remember to do that, we have to use equivalent expressions. We use in that 1 factor of 1, something over itself, whose denominator is the least common denominator found in step 1. Step 3, you're going to add or subtract, because at this point we have a common denominator, and so once you have a common denominator, you're going to add or subtract your denominators, write the sum or difference over that common denominator, and then we're going to simplify or rewrite the rational expression in lowest terms. Alright, so let's try this one. So again, we're adding fractions, so we have to have common denominator. Notice the a is already in common, so we know that's going to be part of our common denominator, but we also have to find a common denominator of 7 and 6. So what we need to do is we need to write everything as its prime factorization. Well, 7 is prime, a to the first is prime, 6 is not prime. It will go into 2 and 3, and then a is prime. Now, to find your least common denominator, you're going to write down anything of your primes, that's your 7, a, 2, 3, and a. Write down anything that's already in common, which we know is the a, and then write down anything that's not in common, which is the 7, the 2, and the 3. And multiply it all together, and of course write it in descending order. So 7 times 2 times 3 is essentially 7 times 6, which is going to be 42a. So that's my common denominator. Alright, so now that we have a common denominator, what we have to do is we have to write equivalent fractions, and we did that in the previous section. So let's go with the first one. What do I have to multiply 7a by in order to get 42a? And the answer is 6. Well, remember, what I multiply the bottom with, I have to multiply the top with. So 6 times 15 is going to be 90. Alright, so here, what do I have to multiply 6a by in order to get 42a? And the answer is 7. So I'm going to multiply by 7 on the bottom and 7 on the top. And so that new numerator is going to be 56. Alright, so now that I have a common denominator, I'm going to combine the top. So 90 plus 56 is going to be 146. And over that common denominator of 42a. And so what I need to do is I need to reduce, because I know 146 and 42 will reduce. I know it'll reduce by 2, which is going to be 73 over 21a. And I don't know that that will reduce again. No. Alright, so that's going to be your answer. So again, let's go through our steps. To add or subtract fractions, the first thing you've got to have is a common denominator. Once you have that common denominator, you have to make equivalent fractions. Once you have the equivalent fractions over that common denominator, you're going to combine the tops, combine your numerators, and leave your denominator alone, your common denominator. And then reduce if you can. So let's look at this one. Look at your denominators. They're not the same. In fact, this one's backwards. They look the same, but this one is going to be backwards. So what I'm going to do, remember how to fix this. You can factor out a -1 and turn it around and get 2x minus 6. Now, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this negative here, which is understood to be a -1, and multiply it times this negative and change this problem completely. So what I'm going to have is 5 over 2x minus 6 plus, because a negative times a negative is a positive, 3 over 2x minus 6. Alright, so one more time. We learned earlier that if you have something backwards, you can factor out a -1 and turn this around. So now these two look the same, but this -1 is in my way to having a common denominator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply this negative times this negative and get that plus. So now I have a common denominator. I'm going to combine the tops over that common denominator of 2x minus 6. Now, I can reduce this, and I can reduce it because I know a 2 will come out of that x minus 6 and give me x minus 3. And the 2 will go into itself one time, and 2 will go into 8 4 times. So that final answer is going to be 4 over x minus 3. So what about this one? 3 isn't a fraction, but we can make it a fraction. Remember, all whole numbers are understood to be over 1. So the common denominator is going to be that 2x minus 3 because it is the only denominator aside from 1 on the other side, and we don't count that. So what I need to do is my common denominator is going to be 2x minus 3. Okay, so the one on the left, the fraction on the left, this one, it's not going to change, and it's not going to change because the denominator didn't change. If the denominator didn't change, then the numerator doesn't have to change. However, this one over here, in order to get 1 to go to 2x minus 3, I have to multiply by 2x minus 3. And remember, we're multiplying by that factor of 1, so I have to multiply the top by 2x minus 3, and I have to multiply the bottom by 2x minus 3. So there's my factor of 1. So on top, I'm going to do the distributive property. 3 times 2x is going to be 6x, and 3 times negative 3 is going to be negative 9. And then, of course, 1 times that denominator is the 2x minus 3. Okay, so now that I have common denominators, I'm ready to combine the tops. Remember, like terms. And remember, this negative goes here and here. So I have a negative 6x. And then I have 7 minus a negative 9. So those double negatives are going to go to plus. So I actually have 7 plus 9, which is going to be a plus 16, over the common denominator of 2x minus 3. Now, for this numerator, I know that it's not in simplest form because I know there's a greatest common factor that I can factor out. And that leading coefficient is negative, and I don't like that either. So what I'm going to do is, I think there's a 2 in common, so I'm going to bring out a negative 2. And when I do that, I'm going to have 3x minus, it changes those signs, 8, over 2x minus 3. And so you may think, well, can I reduce this 2 and this 2? The answer is no, because this is a group. So that's actually going to be your answer. All right, so let's look at this one. Again, to find your common denominator, these are not the same. Okay, you have a trinomial here and a trinomial here, and those trinomials are not the same. So what we need to do is we need to find a common denominator. To do that, we're going to factor each one of these first. So signs are going to be different. Split the x squared into x, and think, what can I multiply together to get negative 6? But subtract to get negative 1, and that's going to be a negative 3 and a positive 2. Over here, signs are going to be the same. Split that x squared into x and x. What can I multiply together to get 6? But add together to get 5, and that's going to be a 2 and a 3 as well. So now, to find the least common denominator, remember, you're going to write down anything that's already in common, which is going to be that x plus 2. Then you're going to write down anything that's not in common, which is going to be that x minus 3 and that x plus 3. So that's going to be your common denominator. Okay, so let's write our new fractions over that common denominator. But remember, we need equivalent fractions. So we're changing some things up. And so what we're going to do, since we changed our denominators, we have to change our numerators by a factor of 1. So look at this. What's different from this denominator, x plus 2 times x minus 3, to the least common denominator? What's different from here to here? And it's that x plus 3. So I need to multiply again by a factor of 1. So I'm going to multiply the top by what's different, which is that x plus 3, and the bottom by that x plus 3. So here is my common denominator, which is here. Doesn't matter how you write it, it's multiplication, it's commutative. But in order for this to be an equivalent fraction, I've got to multiply my numerator times that same x plus 3, which is the distributive property. So 4 times x is 4x, and 4 times 3 is 12. Now we're going to do the same thing on the one on the right. Here's my old denominator, and here's the common denominator. What's different? The x plus 3. So to go from here to here, I had to multiply the bottom by x minus 3. So I've got to multiply the top by x minus 3 as well. Again, that's the distributive property, so x times x is going to be x squared, and x times negative 3 is going to be negative 3x. So now that I have common denominators, I can put my numerators together. Descending order, please. So we're going to go with x squared first, here. And then I'm going to combine the 4x and the negative 3x, which is going to be x. And then I have this 12 here, over my common denominator. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to see if I can factor anything. So right here, this is a trinomial, my leading coefficient's 1, and I need to think, is there anything I can multiply together to get 12, but add together to get 1? And the answer is no, so this is my answer.